I didn't want to look at Joe's leg. I didn't want to imagine what was happening under his climbing salopettes. So I started making tea and porridge in the corner, and I think frying eggs, to make egg sandwiches.
I think the first thing Simon tried to give him to eat was like an egg roll. It was a dried roll that Spinoza, this Peruvian guy, had brought up about 4 days before or 3 days before. So it was like really dry and stale. And I couldn't eat it. I couldn't chew it or anything.
And Simon said we had to look at Joe's leg.
He wanted to cut my boot off. And I can remember not wanting to cut my boot off because they're really expensive.
We planned to cut his climbing salopettes because they were very tight. And Joe got very angry and said, basically, I'm alive because I was wearing this, because they were so warm. And he wouldn't let us cut. So we had to unpeel a banana from the top down over this hugely swollen knee.
It was awful. It was horrendously swollen.
And signs of gangrene and infection. The veins up to his thighs were very dark and black.
Purple, yellows, just horrible looking knee.
So we just pulled up the salopettes again and said, you're leaving here in the morning, you're getting out of here as soon as possible.
I had to spend 2 days on a mule. 3 hours after I got to Simon, he insisted I got on this mule.
It turned out to be pretty difficult, really, because eventually when the donkeys and the mule turned up, we wanted to get going immediately, and in actual fact, they were more interested in all the pots and pans that we'd said they could have. They were sort of collecting together all this swag for themselves, and Richard and I were trying to instill a sense of urgency in them to get us down from, get Joe out of these mountains.
Eventually, we got all the gear packed up, got the mule over, and almost had to kick Joe into life to wake him up. And probably before we got him onto the mule, Simon remembered, or I remembered, about his money.
Before we'd gone up the mountain, Joe had hid some money in the rocks, so we had this very funny scene where we remembered he'd hidden this $200 or something like this, and obviously we needed this. We didn't have a great deal of money between us,
and he didn't really want to hear about that because he was lying there, technically dying, screaming with pain, screaming in agony.
Even with Joe there trying to tell us where this $200 was hidden in a rock, it took ages to find it. Eventually we found it, which was quite a relief. And
then we put him up onto the mule, had to tie him on because he kept slipping.
To this day, I don't know how Joe didn't fall off the mule, and I just can't believe that he didn't fall off it at some point, because he was nodding along, going asleep, slipping in and out of consciousness.
And I remember, I think we just took a few steps and the saddle hadn't been tied on correctly, and he just did 180 degrees and ended up hanging upside down under the mule.
We start to go down further, realise that this mule had a terrible habit of veering rightwards. Joe's right leg, because it was in the splint and broken, he couldn't put it in the stirrup. The mule seemed to sense this and veered rightwards all the time, even though it was being led along. It would actually bash his leg into obstacles, into boulders as it walked past them and things like that. So Richard and I had to take it in terms of constant vigil. We'd got one snow stake left, one aluminium snow stake, and basically we walked behind this mule, and every time it tried to do this, we'd stab it in the backside with the snow stake.
Leading into Waiapa, people were very excited.
We were television for that evening for the entire population of the village. The strongest painkillers we'd actually got with us was something like a codeine, which isn't particularly good for a broken leg. But that situation did improve when we got to Waiapa, because we could at least pour a load of beer down Joe.
When we got to Cajatambo, there were no vehicles in town because word had it that Sendero Luminoso was going to attack. So there were no buses, no vehicles, and somebody had to radio Lima to send up a vehicle.
And it got incredibly frustrating for both of us. We just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible.
And there was a huge argument with the police about how much it was going to cost to radio.
Yeah, it just got really frustrating and very annoying. A lot of shouting at people, a lot of yelling going on.
The vehicle that came was driven by an alcoholic who spent the whole journey back to Lima plying us with spirits and beer.
You know, we'd only been going half an hour and he insisted we stop somewhere, and he drank a lot of beer. Joe drank a lot of beer, which I drank some beer, and then he pelted off down the road further, stopped somewhere else, drink some more beer.
And we didn't really think what was going to happen when we got to Lima. We just said, take us to Lima.
And when I did eventually get to hospital, and they wouldn't honour our insurance agreement and give me any food or painkillers or anything, I lay in hospital for 2 days and I wrote a diary. I just wrote down what had happened.
I guess we must have gone back the next day to the clinic. And I don't remember exactly, but I've got this feeling he was almost in the same state that we'd left him. They'd done absolutely nothing at all because they wanted payment in advance. And he had medical insurance, but that wasn't good enough for them. They actually wanted money up front. It was a kind of horrific end that you go through all that, end up in hospital, and they just don't do anything for you.
His parents actually met us at Heathrow.
Well, I mean, they weren't too chuffed anyway when we got back. You know, most mums aren't, you know. And it took a lot of persuading. Ma and Da picked me and Simon up at Heathrow, and they were pretty frosty because they'd had a very garbled version of what had happened from hospital in Lima.
I suppose they'd heard the sort of skeleton of this story had got back to them, and they were very hostile towards me initially.
I spent the entire journey just explaining what Simon had done, and by the time we got to Leicester, where Simon lived, or near Leicester, you know, I think they thought Simon was the best thing since sliced bread.
But then I just remember we drove back up the motorway, and I suppose, yeah, I just remember them all bickering to one another. Joe and his mum and dad all bickering on at one another, which apparently was their normal behaviour to each other. It was which just made me chuckle, really.
I went straight to hospital when I got back, and Simon went to the Alps and climbed the North Face of the Eiger, I think. The pre-operation, post-operation Peruvian X-rays showed quite clearly that this big chunk that they'd put a bolt through here to hold in place had swiveled, you know, and I could see it. You know, I'd taken the X-rays back with me because it had moved out of position, so it was like that. They didn't want to open the knee up again, and they refractured it by bending it upwards and snapping it back into place and holding the leg up. And they did it twice, and I can't remember how long. I think I was 9 months in plaster and a long time on crutches.
My friends and other sort of climbing partners were not judgmental at all. You know, I mean, I did hear of sort of one or two things that came back to me. Some sort of older people, I should say, in the climbing community. Some had mooted the idea that within the Mount Everest Foundation, within the committees, that some older people had mooted the idea that you know, maybe I should be barred from having a grant to go and climb a mountain again.
And actually, when I heard that, I was quite shocked, and I thought, you know, that this was very unfair on Simon. And I talked to friends of mine, and a particular friend, John Stevenson, said, "Look, you could write a book about it. You know, tell the story as it should, you know, as it happened." And that's why I wrote Touching the Void. I wrote it to tell the story as it was, and it's dedicated to Simon.